The House Oversight Subcommittee on Corporate Subsidies and State Investments will come to order. Will the clerk please take attendance?
Chair Cara.
Here.
Representatives Green.
Present.
Beerline.
Here.
Wagella. Here. Pohetsky.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 5 members present, a quorum.
Vice Chair Green moves to approve the minutes of the October 22nd meeting without objection. So ordered. Today, we'll be hearing additional testimony on the governor's overseas travel and also the Gotion EV battery plant. Welcome John Mozena from the Center for Economic Accountability. If you'll please come up and begin when you're ready. Looking forward to hearing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Kerr, Vice Chair Green, Minority Vice Chair Wagella. Thank you for having me back in front of your committee for a third time. I'm very pleased that you've apparently found enough value in my perspective on economic development to bring me back again, and I look forward to getting the special jacket or whatever when I come back eventually for a 5th time like Saturday Night Live host. I am John Mozena, President of the Center for Economic Accountability. We are a nonpartisan and independent 501c3 that is based here in Michigan and works around the country to bring transparency, accountability, and free market-based reforms to state and local economic development programs across America. While I'm here today testifying in that role I hold at the CEA, I will also note for full disclosure's sake that I'm also a senior fellow at the Reason Foundation, specializing in economic development policy, and hold similar fellowship roles at the nonprofit and nonpartisan think tanks Better Cities Project, ITR Foundation in Iowa, and Bluegrass Institute for Public Policy Solutions in Kentucky. My testimony today does not represent the position of any of those organizations. So, as I said, I work on economic development policy reform across the country, and as someone with that national perspective, but a home and heart here in Michigan, it is heartening to see my beloved home state setting the standard for meaningful legislative oversight of economic development agencies and programs. I've pointed to this subcommittee as a model that other state legislatures should follow to impose desperately needed oversight on their own runaway economic development programs. That legislative oversight is incredibly important because we're sure as heck not getting meaningful oversight of the MEDC from anyone else. And that leads us to the topic of my testimony today, which is what the governor's overseas travel tells us about the way decisions are made about how to transfer taxpayer dollars to private corporations whose interests are prioritized in those deals and who is making or influencing those decisions. As I have discussed with this committee before, the fundamental flaw in the way Michigan does economic development is that, except for taxpayers, virtually everyone in a position of power or influence over the process benefits from the status quo. Nobody with a role in the corporate subsidy decision-making process has a meaningful structural incentive to push for transparency or accountability or to negotiate for the best deal possible for taxpayers or to try to kill a bad deal or publicize failures. Rather, everyone has a personal incentive to go along, to get along, and to keep the taxpayer dollars floating out the door. That applies to these international trips. The elected and appointed officials who get to go on them benefit from VIP working vacations to suspiciously pleasant destinations, and the companies that fund the travel get access and good feelings in return, along with potentially millions or billions of taxpayer dollars, thanks at least in part to the access they get along with their donations. According to its IRS filings, the Michigan Economic Development Foundation's mission is, quote, to lessen the burden of the government of the state of Michigan to promote the public welfare. That sounds laudable, but it's also worth considering the analogy that if you're lessening someone's burden, it means you're putting some of that on your own shoulders. And if you're the one now carrying that burden, it means you get a say in where it goes. This is where I will praise the Detroit News' excellent recent reporting on this topic, which found that companies with MEDF board seats have received $2.2 billion in subsidies from this administration. To that, I will add that it looks even worse if you go further back and further afield. All told, according to my research, of the 29 companies the foundation lists as supporters, 20 of them had some form of tax abatement, grant, or other subsidy from Michigan listed in the subsidy tracker database maintained by Good Jobs First. I'll note that number may actually be higher. I didn't go into all of the potential subsidiaries, DBAs, or other types of options, but that is This is to the questions that Vice Chair Green and Minority Vice Chair Wagella especially were asking at the last meeting about how many of the donors to the MEDF had received subsidies from the state, and the answer is, again, 20 of 29. To answer the question of how much this matters, we can simply look at what corporate site selectors themselves say about it. For the past 39 years, Area Development Magazine has surveyed corporate site selectors about what factors are currently most influential in their decisions about what to build and where. This year's survey tells us that, yes, responsive state and local government officials, the kind of thing you are promoting with an overseas trade trip, they do matter in site selection. They come in 6th. What comes ahead of them, however, are fundamental factors that can't be hand-waved away by a governor on a junket. In order from most important to least, site selectors are looking at labor costs, overall quality of life, energy availability, energy costs, and availability of skilled labor before they get to government responsiveness, which is what the trips are essentially pitching. For what it's worth, I'd also note that we don't get to state and local incentives until 13th place on the list, after factors such as ICT and broadband infrastructure, environmental regulations, construction costs, property taxes, highway infrastructure, and the overall corporate tax rate. I encourage this committee to keep that in mind when talking to the MEDC or others about the importance of subsidies. According to the corporate site selectors themselves, surveyed by the site selection industry's own magazine, those incentives rank only 13th of importance to the site selection decision-making process. And all the overseas trips the governor or MEDC can take can't change a thing about all those other factors that really matter to companies. Your last hearing, the MEDC's representatives talked about how essentially everyone does it, and that governors, lieutenant governors, and MEDC executives must suffer through the horrors of VIP trips to places like China, Japan, Germany, Australia, Italy, Ireland, Spain, the UK, UAE, Bahrain, South Korea, Taiwan, the Netherlands, Germany, Canada, and other well-known hellholes. They referenced the Paris Air Show and how many governors were there. I, for one, am shocked that governors from across the country would happen to decide that Paris was a great place to attend an air show. I noted from the MEDC's presentation that the governor also attended the Farnborough Air Show outside London. You know, I love air shows too, but the last one I went to was in Shreveport, Louisiana. No offense to the fine folks of Shreveport, but I didn't see any governors there, even Louisiana's. Ultimately, whether or not companies are gaining some inappropriate amount of influence with the governor or MEDC by financing their overseas trips wouldn't matter as much if there were meaningful transparency, accountability, and rigorous oversight in place over the process of making deals and ultimately enforcing the provisions. The problem with that is that the primary enforcement entity in that regard is the MEDC itself. That is the same MEDC where, based on the best public information available to me, 5 of the 13 for-profit corporations represented on the MEDC's executive committee have received subsidies in recent years. And of the 8 that didn't, I'd characterize 5 as being in businesses such as auto suppliers, banks, or law firms where they have clients or customers that have received such subsidies. The MEDC likes to talk about Team Michigan, unquote. That's the name they seem to be given the different interlocking layers of authority and influence between the Michigan Strategic Fund, the Michigan Economic Development Corporation's Executive Committee and Corporate Board, the Michigan Economic Development Foundation, local economic development agencies, the state's public universities, major foundations, advocacy groups such as Business Leaders for Michigan, chambers of commerce, labor unions, and elected officials. But the nature of a team is that they have rosters, and either you're on the team or you're not. It's very clear that members of Team Michigan benefit from the economic development status quo. The question is, who is on that team and who isn't? Are you? Am I? Are startup entrepreneurs who aren't well connected enough to get millions of dollars for capital investments in, say, expensive coffee makers? How about a foreign company that might be interested in Michigan but would be a direct and dangerous competitor to a company that funded the governor's trip to their country? Is the average tax-paying Michigander part of Team Michigan? Or are they just spectators to a game that's, let's not forget, supposedly all being run for their benefit? I'd argue that increasingly the evidence says that they are not. And with that, I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mozena, as always, for coming in and testifying. I have a question to start off with before we open it up to other members for questions. When the governor goes overseas, I had asked the MEDC, how does that pitch go? Is it more of just saying what a great economic opportunity a company would have if they moved to Michigan, or are the conversations more along the lines of, here's the special deal and the tax breaks we can give you, essentially bribing them to come to Michigan? Which one of those elements do you think is more accurate in terms of how that conversation goes?
I suspect that that the governor is probably leading with, as you said, sort of the higher end, everything that's wonderful about Michigan, everything our great state has to offer. I think that it becomes a challenge when you start talking about a lot of the factors that I referenced in that area development site selector survey. There's a lot of factors there that companies are looking for, site selectors say they are looking for, that frankly we have challenges with. Things like tax rates and regulation and workforce and things along those lines. Some of them are matters of policy, and some of them are just sort of broader issues. But I would certainly suspect and suggest that if it isn't the governor herself talking about subsidies, that someone else on that trip, whether from the MEDC or otherwise, is certainly having that conversation pretty quickly. The MEDC sort of put it as like, oh, eventually they might come around to it. I guess the question I would ask was, what's the last major company that, from this governor or any other governor in recent memory announced with an international company that did not involve some sort of subsidy? I mean, I think that sort of ends up answering the question for itself.
I was going to ask you that exact question. When was the last time we had a company come over here off of, hey, we like the economic opportunity in Michigan. We don't need any special deal. The governor sold us, or the MEDC sold us on just the wonderfulness of the state without any type of special favor. But you beat me to that question.
I have gray hair, but I don't know that I'm old enough to remember that.
All right, very good. And in that process for the conversations too, it seems like if I was a billionaire businessman from another country and I wanted to decide whether or not I was going to do business in Michigan, would it be more important for the governor and the MEDC to come over and talk with me, or would it be more important for me to go over to Michigan, see for myself, what's it like on the ground there? Do they have a ready workforce? Do they have a good infrastructure? Talking with the locals, feeling and getting a sense. When I've gone and seen some of these sites myself, talking about it in committee is one thing, but when you actually go and you look at it, it brings a whole nother level of understanding about what you're getting into or what all it involves. So does it make sense that we spend so much money going? I mean, it seems like a Zoom call to talk with them, start the conversation, and then, hey, come on over here and see what we have in Michigan. Would that make more sense?
As I've mentioned before when I came here, I spent the first couple decades of my career in the private sector and was around a lot of these sorts of deals. And while we sort of in this kind of environment think of the governor as being incredibly important and powerful, and they are in many ways, to a major corporation, governors just aren't really, frankly, like that big a deal. Like they're big here in the state, but frankly, most major companies have more money than the state of Michigan does. Apple Computer has more than $1 billion a day in global revenues. Most major companies, most of the big companies that Michigan subsidizes have larger budgets than the one you all vote on every year. The idea that the governor is some sort of rock star coming in, any governor coming in as some sort of rock star who's going to make a difference, I think is somewhat oversold and is a sort of maybe more political class view than the way business people would actually look at them. They'd probably look at the governor as somebody who really probably has very little say in the process ultimately, and it isn't going to say no to whatever they ask for to a meaningful degree. The governor is often just sort of a rubber stamp for whatever is presented to them, rather than someone who's actually deeply involved in negotiations. Now, governors like to appear as if they are, because that way they can take political credit for it with voters. There's research from researchers at Duke University and the University of Texas at Austin that finds that a governor who can take credit for, quote, winning, unquote, 1,000 manufacturing jobs with a subsidy deal can move independent voter intent by as much as 9% in the next election when they run for re-election. So governors love looking like they're the ones making these deals, but I don't think that's true in practice, and I certainly don't think, based on my experience, that companies necessarily view them as having that role in the process.
Good. Next question from Vice Chair Green.
And I just want to continue to roll with that, what you were just talking about, because like historically, have you seen how these international trips like align with our long-term economic priorities and strategic priorities, and then the return on investment? So one thing I couldn't get an answer from last week was how these trips, like if we lay out a plan ahead of time strategically and what we want to accomplish. And the answer I received was, well, you can't really measure like relationships and meeting people, but for something that's so important and so visible like this, and that's why I guess I'm just asking, because you've tracked this over time, has there been anything historically where they've laid out a mission specifically for our long-term economic priorities, and have you seen a return on that investment?
I think that the MEDC's the MEDC representative's response at the last meeting, I understood what they were saying was that, that as a sort of ongoing sales and relationship building process, it's difficult to sort of attach an ROI to this one component of it. That it's, like in a corporate sales process, if you're, major enterprise software deal or something like that, like you're going to do ERP software for General Motors, like, saying this one particular trip to meet with the client is worth X amount of dollars in ROI would be very difficult to do. I will say, however, that it is ironic that the MEDC, who is perfectly willing to go way, way out onto very thin economic limbs in taking credit for ROI in all sorts of other things they do, suddenly lose the ability to do so in this. We hear all sorts of predictions about 30 years out, we're going to be able to have, the X number of jobs and this amount of tax revenues to 2 or 3 significant figures in a way that no actual economist would actually be willing to do. That you can't predict the economy 2 or 3 years out, much less 30 years out. So I have not seen any meaningful effort to put an ROI on this. I would say that it would be very difficult to do in a meaningful way, that the number that you would be given would be a number that actually described reality. But I would say that that same issue, that same concern, should then be applied consistently to all of the other places where the MEDC does claim ROI, because very many of the same factors they talk about in these trips specifically are just as true, if not more so, in all the other steps in the process of a company deciding to do business in Michigan, and that humility that they have for the trips would be well served to be applied to all the other ways that they do business.
We had the attorney for the MEDF come in last week to talk about their 501c3 and specifically referenced the donors as being involved in charitable giving. And when I think of charitable giving, I usually think of giving to causes that you don't have expectations of favor or anything in return. Do you see any concern with the MEDF and their operations and the process where big businesses are giving $25,000 type of checks and then essentially getting access to deals from the state of Michigan?
Yes, absolutely. I'm not an attorney. I can't speak to the some of the issues that others have questioned in terms of conflicts of interest or IRS tax law on whether or not these are lobbying expenditures or the like. As an aside there, I will say that I think that one area for this committee to look at, subcommittee to look at down the road, is the degree to which we just sort of pretend that lobbying rules don't exist in the world of economic development. People representing companies go in and ask elected officials, either locally or state level, to have the government take action on their clients' behalf, and that's somehow not lobbying. It seems to apply to Michigan's lobbying rules to me, but that's a tangent there. As I said, according to the best evidence that I can find publicly, 20 of the 29 foundation companies that are currently listed on the foundation's website as supporters have received subsidies, some form of subsidy deal from the state in recent years. I mean, I think that is sort of a telling, whether it's a coincidence or whether it's the nature of the beast. And the obviously the intent is to, sort of get that access and to be able to have a voice on the topic of economic development, whether it is broad policy or whether it is a specific deal that someone else who does not, some other company that does not make that kind of donation would not have. There's been reporting, I believe in the Detroit News recently, about the members of the MEDF board being invited to meals with the governor of the MEDC and the like. That is the kind of access that this gets you. It's not that having a C3 that does lobbying is a bad thing. 501c3s are allowed to do lobbying. My organization is a 501c3. We have filed the correct paperwork with the IRS to do lobbying, because what we do is talk to legislators and elected officials about public policy, and that gets into that enough that we have to be open and honest about that. But the assertion that it's just like I forget what it said, like a church or soup kitchen or the Red Cross, where I spent many years as a disaster volunteer, I took that, I did not take that as a good faith explanation personally. Again, as someone who runs a C3, I would not describe my organization as just like a church or the Red Cross. I mean, we are a 501c3. We are working for the best interests of the community. We are trying to make the world a better place. That's what a C3 is about. But we know what we are doing, which is trying to influence policy, trying to influence the way the world works, and that's the kind of thing that this organization is doing, and it would be good for them to be, I think, a bit more upfront and open about it. And to your question that you asked in the last hearing about would they be willing to reveal all their donors, I mean, correct, there is no requirement that companies do so, and I think that's very important to maintain that. That's a fundamental First Amendment right, to be able to associate without fear of public retribution. But I also think that for an organization that is just trying to make the state of Michigan a better place, that they could remove a lot of the concern and a lot of the mystery around it by being more transparent, just as so many other players in the economic development game could do the same.
Right, and the buck stops on our desk as elected officials. We create this atmosphere where we give these corporate giveaways, and these businesses who are trying to be successful and work within the regulatory environment or the tax structure that's in place, well, they want to pay lower taxes. They want to have an environment where they can be successful, and if they have the means to put their people on boards to get special deals for their company, that's the system that we've created in government, and it's just redistributing, taking our money, the people's money, and giving it to the politically connected. So we're the ones who are accountable and need to be accountable to the taxpayers and not doing this moving forward. I'm going to turn it over to Vice Chair Wagella for another question.
Thanks for being here. Gosh, there's a lot. One, I think it's just kind of ironic that the foundation was created in 1984 based on last committee, if you watched. I just thought that was interesting. Anyway, so a couple things just to clarify. 20 of 29 of the companies listed on the MEDF's website have received subsidies. Is that what you said, correct?
According to the information that I have available, that includes the subsidy tracker database operated by the 501c3 group, Good Jobs First. They developed that database through a variety of sources. I was relying on that, so I can't make the equality of absolute truth. I also noted I couldn't, there might be more because I was not, I couldn't obviously go through every DBA or subsidiary or anything along those lines. But
Yeah,
to the best of my knowledge, it's 20 of 29. That includes both the board and the small list of companies that are listed on the website as supporters but are not at that $25,000 board donor level.
And the reason I bring that up is because I think, we've seen in the Detroit News article at least that, $2.2 billion in economic incentives, or what I would call handouts, have been given to these companies. And I've been up here 3 years, but I've been following a little longer. And, the companies that are listed on the MEDF, DTE, Blue Cross Blue Shield, these giant corporations, it's hard for me to even say that we've passed any bills that these corporations have been opposed to since I've been up here. So I think the problem's a little deeper than just what's going on in the governor's office, right? I think we've seen it in both parties. We see corporations have massive influence. And my question, you said something that really stuck with me, which is if you're not on their team, you're not going to receive the benefits. And what is this team? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, do you think that the bare minimum we should expect from organizations like the MEDF is that they don't operate in the dark, but they reveal their donors and expenditures?
I think that is, as a practical matter, that is a matter of federal tax law. That is there's even Supreme Court cases about that involving the NAACP back when in the civil rights era when Mississippi tried to get them to give up their donor list so that those donors could be intimidated. So I do, and my organization does institutionally have a position that we think that charitable organizations have a right to protect their donors' identity. My organization's donor privacy policy is that we would like to celebrate all of our donors, but we will keep their identities confidential unless they give us specific permission to release it, which we ask everyone that if we can do that. Frankly, for us, that's because we have donors who have work for companies or organizations, including economic development agencies, whose support for us could be politically or personally or professionally harmful to them, and they would lose potentially their jobs for supporting an organization that's trying to make the world a better place. I do think that is a ethical, moral matter, and I don't know all the various potential legal tools available to you, that an organization like that that is taking this sort of almost quasi-governmental role in supporting these official activities of the governor of the state of Michigan, that ethically, it would seem that it's a good idea to do that, and sort of what are you trying to hide? What good reason would they have not to release that? I think that the protestations of this is so much more transparency than most folks have. No, I know plenty of nonprofits out there that release the name of every single one of their donors because that's their policy and they don't see any reason not to. So I think that's a...
Just one more question. I don't know of any charities that I can give to or acts of charity I can have where I'll get 10x my investment on my charity. So do you think it's really fair to call people donating to the MEDF charity? I think to me, it's very clearly not charity when we're getting $2.2 billion of subsidies on the back end.
Morally and ethically, I would agree with you. Legally, that would be a matter for the Internal Revenue Service. And I suppose for the Attorney General, if it is, I'm assuming it is a Michigan nonprofit corporation and that they have the appropriate licensure for charitable activities in the state. So that might be a question for the Attorney General's office on to what degree their activities are consistent with the rules that Michigan places on charitable organizations and behavior, as well as whether what they do, again, this is as a non-lawyer, whether what they do falls into lobbying, and there's limitations on how much of an organization's, how much of a C3's expenses can be lobbying, and it's fairly tight, and that's something the IRS does take very seriously. So.
One last question for you before we change gears. CapCon did some research and a FOIA on the governor's most recent travels to Japan and Singapore, and there's a $25,000 itemization for food. Does that sound like a lot of money to you?
I would say, again, as sort of as I believe it was the MEDC representative said, it sort of depends on how many people for how many days, what kind of environment you're in. I have no issue with. I would hope that the governor and other state employees on the trip would be frugal spenders of the taxpayer's dollar, but I can also imagine there's situations where they would want to sort of wine and dine someone in order to accomplish their stated goals. That's something that without more information, I would be hard-pressed to take a specific thing, but I do think it gets to a larger point of, just how much stuff that isn't, immediately meeting with companies and whatnot goes on these trips. I mean, back in the Snyder administration, we saw photos of him on top of the Great Wall of China. It's like, well, we all know that there's certain amounts of these trips that are more recreation and less work, and I think it would be interesting to try to get some readbacks on what that percentage looks like, and maybe some examples of both that are more than just anecdote, because that's part of it is, yes, there's the economic development side of it, but it's also, like I said, these all happen to be fairly nice places that they're going. I mean, I'm not seeing folks heading to, I don't want to necessarily insult any particular country, but like, Uganda or Congo or something like that, so.
All right, well, thank you for your testimony on that, Mr. Mozena, and we'll go ahead and switch gears now. Our next topic of conversation is on Gotion with the recent developments we have up there in the Big Rapids area. We'll turn it right back over to you to start off that conversation when you're ready.
Oh, okay, thank you. And I still am John Mozena. I first got involved in the Gotion project almost exactly 3 years ago in October of 2022. And at the time, based on the scanty information available just a few days after the announcement, my initial concern with the project, as it was described, was that it seemed to me that it would make no sense to make a 30-year deal around a technology that has such an uncertain future. Just a practical matter. In a Bridge, Michigan op-ed I wrote back on October 6th, 2022, I noted that at that point, the lithium-ion battery itself was only 31 years old at that point, and that it was just pure madness for our state's elected and appointed officials to think that it was a good idea that they could predict what technology was still going to be viable 30 years into the future. And I would love to sort of share my personal favorite way that I illustrated this point, which is that the old cartoon, The Jetsons, with its household robots and flying cars, is set in 2062, which seemed a long way off in 1962 when it ran, but is now a lot more close. And that daughter Judy of the Jetsons canonically would have been born in 2047, which means that she would have been 8 years old when the Gotion deal finally expired. But sort of like less cartoonishly, we've seen over the past 3 years or so that we don't have to wait decades for business conditions to change company strategic plans, especially with something as volatile, both chemically and economically, as EV batteries. Let's not forget that Ford's plans in Marshall, and for that matter in Kentucky, and GM's plans in Lansing both changed fundamentally in less time than it takes me to go through a printer cartridge, even though there were these massive, at times record-breaking state subsidy deals involved. Specifically to Gotion, I became more involved in that deal in the early spring of 2023 when Big Rapids Township board members invited me to speak to a community meeting there back when the Big Rapids Township was still the proposed site of the plant. Meeting was held at the local road commission building, which apparently had the biggest room in the township, and that was still packed to overflowing with people standing out in the hallway. And at the time, the way I would express it is that local residents weren't sort of monolithically for or against the project, but were very concerned that they felt like they were only getting one side of the story. There seemed to be a severe lack of transparency and engagement with local residents, and even with local elected officials, such as township board members. That is a recurring theme. That would become a recurring theme for the rest of the sort of Gotion project's lifespan, and it is a recurring theme I hear from people in communities like Big Rapids, Marshall, Mundy, Detroit, and elsewhere around the state that are the site of these, quote, transformational, unquote, mega projects, that they are desperate for someone who's on their side to help them understand what's going on and make sure they understand both the costs and the benefits of having their communities transformed. I'd invite this subcommittee and others listening to really stop and think about that for a moment, because it's very important. As much as I or others are willing and I to be able to help out in these kinds of circumstances and go talk to communities, there are already people out there who should be the ones representing the community's interests and making sure that local residents and stakeholders have access to all relevant information about these deals. They have names like the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, the Right Place, Flint and Genesee Economic Alliance, Marshall Area Economic Development Alliance, Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. In other words, all these public servants who are employed to represent and protect the public interest. That kind of transparency and accountability and information flow should be their highest priority. Now, it might be hard to keep that public interest in sight when there are factors in play like the Right Place standing to receive $50 million as part of the Gotion deal. Or similarly, when Dr. Bill Pink, president of Fair State University, is on the MEDC's executive committee. According to a 2023 memo to Green Township leadership from the dean of Fair State's College of Engineering Technology, the university was expecting an MEDC EV and mobility grant valued at $659,500 in the program's first year to expand its workforce development programs for battery production and testing jobs tied to the Gotion plant's workforce needs. Now, I certainly do not mean to imply that I think anyone associated with the Right Place or the Fair State or the MEDC or like that intentionally did anything wrong or unethical in relationship to the Gotion deal. I have no evidence for that at all. But I will say that it is incredibly important for us to recognize that the way these mega deals are done almost invariably creates a tension between what's best for the people managing the project on behalf of the public and what's best for the public. That can be and is a corrosive influence. Certainly seems like in the Gotion plant situation, it might have played a role in things like the decision-making that led to situations like local resident Marjorie Steele, whom I believe has testified to the subcommittee, discovering that there had been no environmental impact report prepared on the project before the deal was signed and announced. She should not have had to run back and forth between Big Rapids Township officials and the Right Place that discovered that that kind of basic due diligence had not been done on such a critical issue. Ultimately, as now well known, Big Rapids Township declined the, quote, honor, unquote, of hosting the Gotion plant, and Green Township stepped in, only to have its township board eventually resign or be recalled by local residents who yet again clearly did not feel like their interests were the ones being represented by the people whose job it supposedly is to do so. That created an impasse between the new crop of township board members in Gotion, which gets us to where we are today. One of the most important things I think this oversight subcommittee can do is to ask various players in this deal the question, well, what did we learn from that after failed subsidy deals? And then follow that up with, and what are you planning to change to avoid a similar failure in the future? That process might be of special value to the Right Place and other economic development agencies across the state that could stand to learn from this experience. Again, these local agencies are supposed to be representing the best interests of the people of their communities, but they are also, again, potentially set to receive millions of dollars in association with the deals. I was glad to see it reported that the MEDC is seeking repayment of $23.6 million in strategic site selection readiness program funding from the Right Place. It would have been better not to disperse any of that funding before all the approvals were finalized, or best of all, simply not awarded in the first place. I'll also say here, it feels appropriate to note that the Gotion deal's failure raises question about the wisdom of Governor Whitmer's having appointed the Right Place president and CEO Randy Thalen to the Michigan Strategic Fund Board a few years ago. It's especially true since his slot on the MSF board is statutorily reserved for someone, quote, within the private sector with experience in private equity or venture capital investments, commercial lending, or commercialization of technology, unquote. According to his public LinkedIn profile and the various bios of him at organizations, Mr. Thalen has spent his entire professional career in economic development agencies, save for a 4-year stint as the Economic Development Vice President for the Greater Omaha Chamber of Commerce. I have nothing personally against Mr. Thalen, but having him on the MSF board in a position nominally reserved for someone of private sector experience and bringing that viewpoint to the decisions the MSF makes sends a whole slew of bad messages and raises a whole great number of questions. Finally, I can't let Gotion's parting shot against the people of Michigan go unanswered. In an October 15th letter to the MEDC reported on by Crane's Detroit Business, Gotion attorney Mark V. Heusel, I apologize if I mispronounced that, wrote that the project's failure was due, quote, solely due to racist and ethnically charged stereotypes, unquote. Solely due. That is sadly typical of the way that Gotion and some of its supporters, not all of them, some of them, attempted to frame opposition to this deal. It is a bad faith argument, and frankly, it calls into question whether the company would ever be able to be a good faith partner of that community or of the state if that's the way it's willing to do business or if that's how it thinks we are. Yes, there are racist people in the world. We can't know in everyone's heart. I am sure that there are some individuals who had those kinds of issues. But the simple fact is that the overwhelming concerns about the subsidizing and welcoming of a Chinese company or Chinese nationals had nothing to do with racial or ethnic heritage. Rather, those concerns grew out of transpartisan opposition to the malignant practices of the government of the People's Republic of China. I'm not going to detail all those concerns today. Many of them I would defer to the previous testimony to this committee by former Ambassador Joseph Sella of the Michigan-China Economic Security and Review Group, who could respond far better than I. But the easiest and clearest way to demonstrate the falsity of Gotion's ugly racism charges is to look at the way we never hear any complaints about the presence in Michigan of hundreds of companies from countries such as Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Thailand, India, Bangladesh, or any number of other places full of people Gotion seems that we're all very racist against. Or to make it point even more clear, you don't hear any of these concerns regarding companies from the Republic of China in Taiwan, which the PRC government claims is part of their China. Similarly, nobody had issues with the presence of Hong Kong-based companies in Michigan in the era before the PRC government violated its one country, two systems promises in 2020 and stripped away Hong Kongers' rights to free expression, free assembly, and so much more. For Gotion to allege that the opposition to their project was rooted in racism rather than valid concerns about the role their genocidal, imperialist, and dictatorial government would play in our state and in our communities is an insult to the people of the Big Rapids area and to the state of Michigan as a whole. We are better off without them, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mozena, and I always appreciate your courage to jump right into some of those more controversial topics and just delve right into it. So I'll start right where you finished, right there with the concept that was pitched that what's going on is because of racist motivations. I had a conversation with Jim Chapman, the former township supervisor, and I had asked him specifically regarding the dynamic, because when I make arguments about the taxpayers, and I'm looking out for the people of Michigan versus these big business and big government interests, and then if we look at China, for example, are we looking out for the Chinese Communist Party and the big businesses that grow up around it, or for the Chinese people? Because when we have so many goods that are made in China and exported to America, and they don't get to consume as much as they produce over there, the people in China suffer from these economic policies and their massive exports relative to the amount of imports they have in China. So what I believe is the racial injustice that's being done is the fact that China has an artificially weak currency which leads them to run those massive trade surpluses, which leaves their people not able to consume as much as they work so hard to produce. The injustice is being done to the people of China, and he's standing up for the CCP and the big corporations that grow up around them. So I would like to flip the script and say we're called to knowledge and wisdom, and we should look at the injustice that's being done to people around the world and how these corporate elite policies are making people suffer, not only in our country, but others. I know that's kind of heavy, but
I would
what are
say
your
that
thoughts?
as a Michigan taxpayer, I don't want I think I would agree to you to the point that I don't want my taxpayers or my tax dollars subsidizing profits that will then be taxed to fund all of the various ways that the government of the People's Republic of China oppresses its citizens, that it operates genocidal slave labor camps, that it destroys the global environment in source of economic power, all these sorts of things. I think more broadly, the issue is, the big issue is that the concerns that I heard overwhelmingly from the people of Big Rapids Township, Green Township, and the broader Big Rapids community, yes, the issue of China was one of them, and whether they wanted something so tied to that power structure in their community. But overwhelmingly, even before sort of China was a big issue, there was still a great deal, as I said, of opposition, of concern to this deal, simply because whether this was a Chinese company, French, German, American, whatever, the transparency issue, the degree to which this was a deal being done for the community or to the community. And that was the same thing that I've seen happen. We've seen that happen. This community's talked to people in Marshall, in Money Township, in Detroit, and any number of communities across the state where the issue isn't the nationality of the company involved or who the profits are going to, but rather the process through which these kinds of deals are negotiated, signed, and set supposedly in stone before the companies that are being, or the communities that are being transformed have any say in the issue if they ever do at any point in this process. In the last meeting, I know Minority Vice Chair Wagella talked about the fact that he's opposed to subsidizing any company, whether from China or otherwise, and I think that is a perfectly legit. I share that, and that is, we can avoid this entire topic just by saying that shouldn't be the purpose of the government of the state of Michigan. It should be to create an environment in which any business is welcome to come here and run a good business that creates good jobs and is a good member of the community.
There were two different routes where money was being prepared by the state as these handouts to Gotion. You had $175 million total. $125 million of it was CIP funding, which was never appropriated to Gotion. Of the $50 million in the Strategic Site Readiness Program, the SSRP, $23.7 million had been given from the MEDC to the right place, and then from the right place, where all that went and what all it got spent on by Gotion. They bulldozed and tore down a bunch of trees, and there's not a building there, and there's not a whole lot of infrastructure to show for it. What they spent all that money on, I don't know. Do you have any knowledge on that or any feedback?
No, not the details, and I have not seen any indications. If I missed them, I apologize, but I haven't seen any indication that information has been publicly reported, which, frankly, again, it should be. Companies are asking the people of Michigan, say the taxpayers or just the people of Michigan, anyone who depends on the services of the government, anyone who's a resident of the state, to essentially become an investor in their company. That would imply to me that the people of the state of Michigan ought to have just as much access to information about the details of what's being done with the money they've invested as any bank loan officer or hedge fund operator or Wall Street trader or venture capital firm investor. Like, if you're going to make the people of Michigan your business partners, then you have to treat us like your business partners and not just as a slot machine that you can put a nickel into and get a couple $100 million out of.
What should happen with that $23.7 million that has gone to Gotion?
My preference, and I think the sort of moral, ethical thing would be to get it back. As a practical matter, I would be surprised if it were possible to get it back. As you said, some of it's been spent on things like bulldozer fuel and the like. And I mean, hopefully, as a practical matter, like something else can happen, whether it's the sort of the one big project, or I know there's been some reporting about other opportunities for companies looking at sort of smaller companies with more of a openness to engaging proactively and healthily with the community, or talked about taking some of that space maybe. In the grand scheme, like, the money shouldn't have been spent, as I said, without the deal being done. Like, everybody who needed to signing off. That's a sign of poor management when you're putting money into something that still isn't done yet. And that's a question, again, that's one of those questions about well, what did we learn from this, and what are you going to do in the future to get, whether it's the MEDC or MSF or the various local economic development agencies, to just be like, look, not a dime goes out the door before everything, all the paperwork is done. Preference would be to not do the deals at all, but if we're going to be doing the deals, that should be pretty basic. I mean, that's the way a business would be working on it.
Right, and there's a Renaissance zone that is there in the community in Green Township. What should happen to that Renaissance zone? And just for clarity, that's where they get their tax exemptions, local and to the state. Should we continue to allow that Renaissance zone for another company to come in, or get rid of it entirely?
Renaissance zones, like sort of other situations where you're sort of drawing a border around a specific piece of geography, whether it's a Renaissance zone, an opportunity zone, a TIF district, downtown development authority, all those sorts of things. They all have the fundamental flaw that overwhelmingly what you are doing is you are concentrating development in there because you're creating an incentive to be there. But the flip side of that is it's sort of the seen and the unseen in the French economist Bastiat's famous formulation that you see all the growth. What you don't see is the growth that doesn't happen elsewhere. So it's the analogy I've used is sort of like you spread a bunch of poker chips on the table and you reach out and you sort of scoop them all in one place. And that zone's looking great. There's a lot of chips there, but now there's not as much for everybody else at the table. So these zones are a sort of rob Peter to pay Paul, or at least subsidize Peter to impoverish Paul mechanism. And in virtually every case of which I'm aware, I'm not saying 100% of the time, but I could imagine situations where there might be some value here and there, disaster relief and things along those lines. But in virtually every sort of general use, they are more of an exercise in political favoritism and the kinds of picking winners and losers at the sort of municipal rather than corporate level that leads to bad public policy.
Good. Next question from Minority Vice Chair Wagella.
This one for me, I don't really, I think it's necessary for like the opposition to this project just because it's from China. I'm not saying China shouldn't have any criticisms, right? It should, but as all countries do. I mean, our country's actively sending our tax dollars to fund a genocide right now as well. So what I will say, though, is I think that I'm not going to sit here and listen to your crap anymore about...
Representative, let's let him share his perspective here.
What I'm saying is I don't believe... I think the argument is stronger when we say no corporations should receive taxpayer money. Right? I think that makes a lot of sense. Most people in this country, I think, would agree they don't want their tax dollars going to fund private business. And I think that that's a strong argument. And I'm curious if you think the argument on its face is stronger to have a united front to say, me and Rep. Carr here don't agree on everything, but we agree that corporations should not receive taxpayer-funded money and have certain advantages over others.
Insofar as I agree with you to the concept of we just should not be subsidizing businesses of whatever nationality or background. That is not a useful function of the state. It's not good economics. It's not a good idea, and we shouldn't be doing it. As to the other assertions, I think that I agree with you that if we simply did that, it would mean that we didn't have to have those kinds of disagreements as we just heard about. So to the economic policy of just simply not doing subsidies, yes, absolutely. That is one of the founding principles of our organization, is that at the long run, there is no evidence that we should be doing this. It's morally wrong, it's economically wrong, and the real world evidence just is that it doesn't work. So let's stop doing things that don't work, and then we can disagree on the other policy areas in the way that the political process works.
I'll just briefly say, Minority Vice Chair Wagella, I'm going to give myself some latitude here to just say that the conversations and the perspectives that you have, we do not always agree. But like I say with Bernie Sanders, he opens the book up to the correct page. I just believe he has the book upside down. And I love the conversations that you and I get to have, and we get to tackle these types of questions and look into this type of corruption. And I just want to let you know, I appreciate where you're coming from as much as we disagree at times, and keep doing what you do to ask the right questions. And we'll do the best that we can to get to the bottom of what's going on, whether we agree or disagree. So I just wanted to say that. I will just ask one last question, I think, because I don't see any other questions. My last question I'll ask you, Mr. Mozena, is with Randy Thalen, my thoughts on it, he's testified here before. And I thought, when he testified and when I spoke with him briefly, other than that one other time, he seemed to be a very pleasant guy, very likable, great demeanor. And he's just operated as the type of businessman who has involved himself very closely with that working relationship with government, finding those ways to get those special tax breaks, seeing where you might be to find an edge here or there. And when he has this explicit position that is meant for somebody of the private sector, yet his entire work environment has been around these, what seems like taxpayer-funded public purposes, then we have Article 4, Section 30 that says that you need 2/3 support in order to appropriate funds for private purposes. Is it private purposes or is it public purposes? It seems like they want to have their cake and eat it too, in terms of, is this following the Michigan Constitution when we give these handouts without 2/3 support? Is it a private purpose or is it a public purpose when we give these big taxpayer handouts? What are your thoughts?
I agree with you that I believe it should be a public purpose. I believe that both here in Michigan and around the country, most state constitutions have gift clauses or other mechanisms that would seem, just sort of from a straightforward textual reading, to oppose these kinds of handouts. And yet over time, we've gotten these sort of giant money fountains that have built up sort of despite that, and various courts and various opinions and the like have made it so that these constitutions don't get applied in a way that, again, would seem fairly straightforward. I would, again, personally, I haven't spoken a great deal with Mr. Thalen. I believe that he's a well-intentioned, experienced professional. I've said in the past, I have had very pleasant, thoughtful discussions with Mr. Messer at the MEDC. I think that overwhelmingly the people in these roles are good folks who are trying to do right as they see it within the environment that they are given, within the environment that they see it, that they believe that sort of like maybe that it's the game that they have to play because that's what the game, so let's do the best that they can. At which point I would say that it is this legislature's job and duty and responsibility to change that game, to Vice Chair Wagella's point of shouldn't we just not be subsidizing anything, to create an environment in which these professional, experienced, well-intentioned, good-hearted people could do more useful and important things that would actually improve the business climate for everyone in Michigan, every business, small, big, intermediate. I say that, these whether it's the governor's trips or projects like Gotion or whatever, we have this bias towards sort of big game hunting. But one of the single most dependable factors that you can look at in terms of predicting what a place's economy is going to look like in the future is the small business formation rate. Growth comes from small businesses growing into big businesses. Big businesses are big. They've gotten their growth done already. So an environment, if this legislature can move us to an environment where it is conducive to everyone, to entrepreneurs and big businesses alike, we'd be much better off.
Okay, thank you. One last question from Minority Vice Chair Wagella.
And I'll be brief. I think 40% of Michigan families are struggling to pay their bills and meet their needs right now. I don't think any of us up here would argue that things fundamentally in our economy need to improve for working class folks. Would you argue, or can I get you to concede that if we can make life better for the working class, and I think we might have different theories on how to get there, but it is kind of an absurd gesture right now to have this level of inequality in this country with big business having such access to the political establishment, if you will, and then so many people struggling that actually if we could raise the bar for people, whether that's through free market policies or through things that I would argue for, that actually would be better for business in general because people would have more money to spend and have a better standard of living.
Yeah, there's some stuff in there to pick apart, but broadly, yes, absolutely. I mean, the making life better for everyone in Michigan is both sort of the fundamental job, let's go around, protecting people's rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as well as a practical economic matter, as I referenced the site selection survey from Area Development Magazine. When you've got sort of workforce availability, workforce cost, and quality of life are among the top things. And what does that mean? Well, that means, is this a place where there are sort of those working folks you talk about? Do they have a good quality of life? Is this the kind of place where you want to be? If you're somebody like a electrician or a mechanic or a CNC machinist or any number of these other jobs that are hard to find, truck driver, do you want to live in Michigan? You could go pretty much anywhere in the country and get a job. I have a young cousin who's an auto mechanic and is sort of looking at where he wants to go live because he knows wherever he moves, he'll be able to get a job. Does he want to stay here in Michigan? Well, frankly, the thing that's keeping him here is family and not the environment or the potential future. So I think to that point, yes, absolutely. If we can focus on broad-based policies that improve things like education, healthcare, all those sorts of stuff, whatever that might be, that is, in fact, the fundamental answer for how you grow an economy.
Well, thank you for your testimony, as always, Mr. Mozena.
Thank you, as always, for having me.
And next up, we will have Representative Tom Kunse. He represents the area where Green Township is. Looking forward to hearing what you have to share with the committee today.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee that are present, thank you for having me here today. I appreciate that. My goal is to be a little bit more pragmatic and practical. I don't want to talk macroeconomics. We understand corporate subsidies are not working. What I want to do is unwrap this issue. This is my district. These are my people. And the pointy end of the spear has been a little township called Green Charter Township, north of Big Rapids, and they have led the fight on this. I put in a legislative spending request to help them with their legal fees, and that didn't make it through the budget process. That remains a priority of mine, so I'm still gonna push for funding to help them in this fight that I think we all agree now was misdirected. But I do have some specific questions, and I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm asking questions that may unfairly, I don't expect you to have them, but I want to get these out. This is what I'd like to know. So I don't expect you to have the inner workings of the MEDC or the Right Place or the Michigan Strategic Fund or the State Readiness Plan, almost a corporate shell game there. But I think it's important that we realize here's what I'm trying to do. So specifically, we talked about the Renaissance Zone. And Mr. Chairman, would you like me to go through my questions or what is best?
It's your time, however you'd like to do it. Yes, thank you.
Very good. Well, I'm trying to be respectful. I know Representative Fox is back here anxious to testify also. So this project, there's a lot of unanswered questions. And I think, you said something, Mr. Chairman, that really stuck with me. The buck stops here. Well, it's literal and figurative, but this committee should find out where was the money spent and how do we get that back? And that's what I'm trying to do with these questions here. So there is a lien on the property. As a matter of fact, the state of Michigan is in second place on the lien. So forgive me, I always say this wrong, East West Bank has a UCC filing on this property. So here's where my legal knowledge stops. But yes, there is a lien on the mortgage, $24.6 million on a $6 million piece of property, and we're in second place. So I don't know, Mr. Chair, if this is the committee's intent to get these questions answered or to move forward, but that is my goal. I'd like to find out the answers. And then, of course, there is ongoing legislation right now, there's ongoing litigation against my township. So I'd like to get that resolved. Any resolution of this project has to include a cessation of litigation against Green Charter Township. And I'd like to talk about recouping some of their legal fees. So in the essence of time, I'm not going to go through and read my questions. They have them. I've detailed them. I do have a couple copies left I'll share with the audience. But does the board have any questions for me?
I think just one quick one from me.
Please.
and
I
that
don't
is,
believe you that it's a quick one.
But how much is the request for the legal fees that you had in your LDSI request?
I requested $275,000, and that is not.
$275,000, and they got $175 million. It was the proposal for them. It seems
Correct.
like, compared to that number, that's a small dollar to assist the community after everything they've gone through.
Correct. I agree.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
I was disappointed it didn't make it through the budget process. I understand, but that does remain a priority of mine, Mr. Chair.
All right, and then a quick question from Vice Chair Green.
Do you know how much the annual budget of that township is?
Representative, I apologize for that.
That's fine. I've just, usually townships that size, that is their annual budget is about 200,000.
Correct. And I was going to say, we're right in that 250 to 300,000. So they have run a deficit the last few years, and they're working on this, but their Green Charter Township is the pointy end of the spear. They're leading the fight against this. And it is the definition of David versus Goliath. And we know how that story ended, and it did again, so.
There certainly is a sticker shock to a lot of the dollar amounts that we hear in this committee, but I guess
Correct.
this sticker shock for that number was on the other end of how small it is.
Very good.
Thank you, Representative Kunse, for
And
your
I'm not
testimony.
entirely sure that it's their total legal fees. I think total, the issue is I don't know. There's total legal fees, there's outstanding legal fees. Some have been paid, even if we could recoup some of those. So
Yes. Thank you, Representative
thank you very
Kunse.
much for your time. Thank you.
Appreciate you. All right, and last but not least, we have Representative Joe Fox. If you'll come up and testify when you're ready, looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the committee. And I think I have just been asked to come and tell a story, so I will tell my story. Right now, I represent the county that runs right next door to Green Township. And the great fear of people in my county was what happens if, because the Muskegon River ran nearby and it runs all the way through Newaygo County. So that's how I got my nose into this. Besides that, being a person who encouraged the Green Township people, attending many meetings, attending a rally. And I plan on attending a gathering this Saturday where they're going to be rejoicing. The song that's being sung in Green Township is Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. Witch, old witch, the wicked old witch, okay? In relation to the ending of Green Township. So this story, just very quickly to give you a microcosm of what I experienced. I went in the spring of 2023 along with Rep. Cara and along with another rep to visit Green Township. We were going there for a rally that was going to happen later that afternoon. And at that rally were people like presidential candidate Perry Johnson, who was standing against it, Ambassador Pete Hoekstra. I think Rep. John Molinar was there. A lot of people wandering up and down the street near Ferris. But beforehand, Rep. Carr, myself, and the other legislator decided to stop by Green Township and see what could happen. So we planned to meet with Jim Chapman, the supervisor of Green Township at that time. And I felt like I was walking into an Old West saloon in some ways, okay, because Mr. Chapman came in with his sidearm strapped on his side against these three big, mean legislators who were sitting there. I'm being a little bit sarcastic. There were no cookies and milk offered to us, just a seat at the table with a gun strapped to his side. I don't know what he thought he was doing, but definitely, based upon meetings I had attended, it was a crazy situation because I had watched in previous meetings where again a former township trustee had snickered when asked, they'd kind of giggled when asked, well, how much are you profiting from this? Okay, and stuff like that had gone on. It was just totally clear. So, long story short, Mr. Carr got into the whole questioning, which he is good at all these type of questions. Is this a free market situation or is this a central planning thing? What's driving this, And I will say there was nothing racist rattling around in the room, okay? It was just, and he was just met with belligerence, in the responses. Finally, I had had enough, and this is getting to the end of my story. And I just basically looked at Mr. Chapman and I said, Mr. Chapman, what will your legacy be? What will your legacy be? What are you going to leave behind after all is said and done? And my personal opinion is he's already experiencing his legacy right now as people sing, ding dong, the witch is dead. Mr. Chapman got up and walked out of the room in a huff, and we as three legislators decided to do a house-to-house survey in the nearby houses, and we ended up finding out real quickly before we went to the rally that we interviewed 36 people at their doors. 30 people were against Gotion moving in, 6 people were for it, okay? That was our simple, quick, hour-long house-to-house survey. Then we went to the rally. And it just became clearly evident that, generally speaking, the people in that neck of the woods were not in favor of Gotion. Story concluded. Thank you.
Absolutely, Representative Fox. Yeah, they would try to make claims like there was a silent majority who was in support, and that simply was not the case. And we saw the hundreds of millions of people who showed up for that rally, and
I don't know it was millions, it was hundreds.
I'm used to those big numbers, my apologies. No, there were hundreds. I wouldn't say there were even thousands, but yes, there were hundreds of people who showed up for the rally. Thanks for the correction. I didn't even know I had missaid that. And anyway, it was quite the experience with Mr. Chapman, and it was just entertaining because he went back and forth with me for 15 minutes on the economics of it all, and just took from a gentle giant like yourself, a good man, just asking him what his legacy was going to be in the most calm way possible, and he stormed out of the room. So that was surprising to see, but I appreciate what you do, Representative Fox. And I would say we were done there, but did you have a question, Representative Green? Vice Chair Green has one quick question.
So it would be because your townships are not alone in these battles with these either mega sites or data centers or solar projects across the state of Michigan. So if you had encouragement to give to other municipalities, what would that encouragement be?
My encouragement again and again in relation to this and a whole lot of things is let's start from the local and work our way to the state and not vice versa. We've got to talk to local people. We have to make sure that our local ordinances are in line. We, as a state, are not God. And I know the local people aren't God either, but there's a whole lot of them, and they really care. Farmers really care about their agricultural land. These Green Township people really care about the streams and the rivers and the creeks that run there nearby. And we got to start from, and I don't like to call it the bottom, we got to start from local and go to state and not vice versa. Yeah.
Looks like we have a question from Minority Vice Chair Wagella.
Yeah, so kind of like building off what I was talking about earlier, and this is kind of to pinpoint. as we heard people come in and testify about this, it was very clear to me that this was about more than just being the company Gotion, right? It was about environmental concerns. It was about land being snatched up and what that might do. And you're on the ground in the district near. So my question is, if this factory was going to be built by, say, Ford rather than Gotion, would have the pushback still been the same? Because the understanding I have is that it would have been, that people did not want this project for a variety of reasons, and they did not believe it should be taxpayer funded.
I would agree that I think it was a variety of reasons. And very honestly, you know, the China piece of the puzzle was one of the puzzle pieces on the table. It wasn't the puzzle piece. And again, I would stress that the local people need to be involved, you know. And I'm not a fan of the solar projects, not a fan of the wind projects. And again, because of our mentality of top down, you know, telling the locals what to do. So.
Thank you for your testimony, Representative Fox.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry I have to excuse myself to another meeting.
Well, seeing no further business, we're done here as well. The committee will stand adjourned.